The gunshot was a flat final crack that cut through the screams and shattered glass of the redemption bank. It wasn't the wild report of a nervous man's pistol. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a cold, declarative sentence. Rowan Pike, who had been making his way toward the general store, froze mid-stride. He, like everyone else on Main Street, was caught in the tableau of terror. Dust motes danced in the bars of afternoon sunlight, and the smell of gunpowder, acrid and metallic, was already beginning to hang thick and heavy in the air. Two men burst from the bank's double doors, canvas sacks slung over their shoulders, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas. They were clumsy, panicked, their movements jerky as they scrambled for their horses. But the third man, the one who followed them out, moved with a different kind of energy. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black duster that seemed to absorb the light around him. He didn't run. He walked, his boots scuffing a deliberate rhythm on the boardwalk. His face was uncovered, sharp and angular, with eyes the color of a winter sky. He held a silver-plated Colt with an unnerving stillness, as if it were an extension of his own hand. This was the man who had fired the shot. This was Silas Croft. Rowan had seen men like him before in the war. Men who had looked into the abyss and found it to their liking. Men who killed not with passion or fury, but with the dispassionate precision of a butcher dressing a carcass. As Silas Croft swung into his saddle, his movements fluid and economical, something small and metallic slipped from the pocket of his duster. It hit the boardwalk with a faint, almost musical clink, then bounced into the thick dust of the street, unseen by its owner. Croft and his men were already gone, a thunder of hooves and a rising cloud of pale dirt, leaving behind a silence that was louder than the preceding chaos. The townsfolk, who had huddled in doorways like frightened sparrows, began to emerge slowly, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable, whose bravery was clearly outmatched by his appetite, waddled out of his office, his gun drawn but held with the trembling uncertainty of a man who had arrived too late and was profoundly grateful for it. Rowan's instincts, honed by years as an army scout, told him to mount his own tired horse and ride north to leave this town and its fresh corpse to fester. His vow was simple: never get involved. Involvement led to attachment, and attachment led to loss. He had a lifetime's worth of loss already packed into the saddlebags of his memory. He was here for flour, coffee, and nails, nothing more. But his feet didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the spot in the street where the small object had fallen. Acting on an impulse he didn't understand, a flicker of the scout's ingrained habit of noticing the details others missed, he walked forward. The dust was still settling, coating everything in a fine, gritty powder. He bent down, his fingers brushing the dirt aside until they closed around a small silver locket, tarnished and dented, but still intact. It was cool to the touch. He thumbed the clasp and it sprang open. Inside, protected by a tiny pane of glass, was a daguerreotype of a young man in a Union soldier's uniform. He couldn't have been more than 18. His face was unlined, his eyes bright, with a naive optimism that Rowan hadn't seen or felt in a very long time. For a split second, a ghost of a memory surfaced in Rowan's mind, the smell of pine and campfire smoke. The chilling sound of a bugle call, at dawn the weight of a terrible choice. It was a fleeting, disjointed image, a half-forgotten nightmare that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a familiar ache in his chest. He snapped the locket shut, the click echoing the finality of the gunshot, and slipped it into his pocket. He would rid himself of it, later toss it into a canyon. For now it felt like a lead weight tying him to a place he desperately wanted to leave. The afternoon sun cast long skeletal shadows down Main Street as Rowan turned away from the bank and the gathering crowd. The air was thick with whispers of the townsfolk weaving a narrative of the horror they had just witnessed. The murdered man was the teller a young man named Peterson, with a wife and a new baby. The robbers had been efficient, brutal, but most of the talk centered on the cowardice of the law. Sheriff Gable hid under his desk, one man scoffed near the smithy. And that new deputy of his, Miller, saw him peeking from the alley. Did nothing, another added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Rowan ignored them. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside the little bell above the door, announcing his presence with a cheerful jingle that felt obscene. The store was empty, the proprietor likely gawking with the rest of the town. Rowan gathered his supplies, flour, coffee, a small box of nails, a strip of jerky, and left the coins on the counter. His business here was done. His vow of detachment remained for the moment intact. He retreated to his horse, his mind already turning northward to the quiet solitude of his cabin, to the familiar embrace of loneliness that asked nothing of him. He untied the reins, ready to put redemption and its fresh ghosts behind him. He had learned the hard way that a man alone can't be broken by the loss of others. He just had to keep moving. He swung a leg over the saddle, his boots finding the stirrups, when a small, insistent tug on his worn cavalry coat stopped him. "Sir, they're blaming him. The sheriff's deputy. They say he was a coward." Rowan looked down. A little girl, no older than 8, stood staring up at him, her bare feet planted firmly in the dust. Her dress was a patchwork of faded calico, her dark hair a tangled mess, but her eyes held a fire that defied her hollowed cheeks and the grime on her face. She was the same child from the original story, but the context was entirely different. Her desperation was no longer a simple plea for help. It was forged in the immediate violent aftermath of the robbery. She pointed a small, determined finger toward a cluster of angry men gathered near the sheriff's office. In the center of the circle was a young man in a deputy's uniform, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was barely a man, maybe 20 years old, with eyes that darted about like a cornered animal. The townsfolk were haranguing him, their voices a low, vicious buzz. The young Deputy Miller just stood there taking it, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. "He's the only one who's been kind to us," the little girl insisted, her grip on Rowan's coat tightening. "He brings us scraps from the saloon kitchen when he can. But the widow Clark, she's using this. She says the town's got no patience for cowards or for folks who can't pay their debts. She wants our land, our home." Before Rowan could process this, another figure emerged from the alley beside the general store. A young woman who held herself with a stiff, defiant pride that seemed at odds with her torn dress and the dark, fading bruise that marred her cheekbone. She moved with a purpose, grabbing the little girl's arm. "Lahi, leave the man be," she said, her voice low and strained, but laced with steel. "We don't need charity." This was Mara Dawson. Her dark eyes met Rowan's, and in them he saw not just fear or shame, but a profound and weary strength. She kept one arm folded over her chest, a futile attempt to hide the torn neckline of her dress, a gesture that spoke volumes about the kind of fight she had been waging long before the bank robbers arrived. Lahi pulled away from her sister. "But Mara, he has to help Deputy Miller try to stop them from hurting you last week. Now they're going to run him out of town, and the widow will take everything. There'll be nowhere left to go." Rowan's gut tightened. The pieces clicked into place with grim clarity. The robbery wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a catalyst. It had agitated the town's simmering cruelty, and the widow Clark, whoever she was using the chaos to tighten her grip. His simple plan to buy supplies and disappear was unraveling. The silver locket in his pocket felt heavier, a tangible link to the violence that had set these events in motion. His decision to help was no longer about pity for 2 orphans. It was about a young deputy being made a scapegoat, about a conspiracy brewing beneath the town's dusty surface, and about the look in Mara Dawson's eyes, the look of a soldier holding a lost cause, refusing to surrender. He had seen that look in the mirror too many times to ignore it in someone else. He swung his leg back over and dropped from the saddle, the dust crunching under his boots. He crouched slightly to meet Lahi's gaze. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and even. "Lahi," she said, "and she's Mara. She's all I have." Rowan nodded once. He looked from Lahi's fierce hope to Mara's bruised pride, and then to the young deputy being swallowed by the mob. He had ridden into town seeking solitude, but he had stumbled into a war on a different front. And as much as he hated it, he knew he couldn't ride away. Some lines once crossed could never be unseen. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out the strip of jerky and placed it in Lahi's hand. Then he straightened, walked to Mara, and held out his hand. "My cabin is a half-day's ride north," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll be safe there. We'll sort out the rest later." Mara hesitated, her eyes flashing with suspicion. Trust was a currency she clearly didn't have. But then she looked back at the angry crowd and the predatory way some of the men were now watching her, and her defiance seemed to crumble, replaced by a grim acceptance. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Rowan turned and faced the town. His expression didn't change, but his presence was a statement. He was no longer a transient drifter. He had chosen a side. He lifted Lahi onto the saddle, then helped Mara up behind her. As he mounted, he saw the town matriarch, a stern woman in black bombazine, step onto the porch of the hotel. Widow Clark. Her eyes cold and sharp as chips of flint met his across the street. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a cool, calculating assessment. A silent declaration of war had been made. Rowan turned the horse and rode north, the weight of two sisters and an unfolding conspiracy settling onto his shoulders. The vow he had lived by for a decade was broken. He was involved now, tangled in the fate of strangers, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the violence of this day was only the beginning. The trail north was a winding scar etched into the dry, unforgiving land. Low, rocky canyons flanked them, and their sandstone walls glowing a deep, bloody red in the setting sun. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, the scent of dust and sage giving way to the sharper perfume of pine. Rowan kept the horse at a steady, ground-eating pace, his senses on high alert. He had felt eyes on them since they'd cleared the last dusty outpost of redemption. It was a familiar feeling, the prickle on the back of his neck, that had kept him alive on countless scouting missions deep in enemy territory. He didn't need to look back to know they were being followed. Two riders, he guessed, keeping their distance, using the terrain for cover. Amateurs, but persistent. Mara, seated behind Lahi, must have sensed his tension. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clop of the horse's hooves. "Company," Rowan replied, his voice a low rumble. "Stay quiet and hold on tight." He nudged the horse off the main trail, guiding it into a narrow wash littered with loose rock and skeletal cottonwoods. This was his territory. The cat-and-mouse game began. He used every trick he'd ever learned, doubling back through a dense thicket of manzanita to obscure their tracks, leading the horse across a wide slab of slick rock that would leave no print, pausing in the deep shadows of an overhang to listen. In the silence, he could hear the faint clatter of a dislodged stone far behind them. They were still there. During one of these pauses, while Lahi dozed fitfully against her sister's chest, Mara spoke again, her voice tight with a desperate need to make him understand. It wasn't a fever that took them. "My parents." Rowan remained still, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them. "Tell me, it happened a month ago." They were fine one morning, sick by nightfall. The doctors said it was a swift-moving fever, but it wasn't like any fever I'd ever seen. They were gone by sunrise. Both of them. Her breath hitched. The very next day, Widow Clark came to our homestead. She had a debt ledger. She said my father had borrowed heavily for seed and medicine over the years. The numbers were impossible. He was a careful man. He never would have owed so much. You think she faked the ledger? Rowan asked, his gaze never wavering from the landscape. I know she did. Mara said, a new hardness in her tone. When I challenged her, she just smiled. A cold, thin smile. She said the debt was now mine, and since I had no way to pay the land, and everything on it was hers. She offered to let us stay to work off the debt. But the work she had in mind, it wasn't in the fields. The story confirmed Rowan's suspicions. This was a calculated land grab, and the widow Clark was its architect. Silas Croft's robbery had simply provided the perfect cover, a wave of fear and chaos to mask her final move. And the men who were following us? Rowan asked. Hers, or his, Mara whispered. The man from the bank, Silas Croft. I've seen him in town before talking with the widow. They're connected. Rowan urged the horse forward again, this time into a labyrinth of canyons so narrow they had to proceed in single file. The walls rose high on either side, blotting out the last of the daylight. He knew this area like the back of his hand. It was a place where a man could lose his shadow. After another hour of twisting, silent travel, he reined in the horse and listened. There was nothing but the whisper of the wind through the rock formations and the steady breathing of the two sisters behind him. He had lost them. By the time they reached his cabin, a full moon had risen, bathing the small clearing in a stark silver light. The cabin was small and square-built of sturdy pine logs, with a stone chimney and a deep porch. It was a fortress of solitude, built to keep the world out. Now, he was inviting it in. He dismounted, lifting a sleeping Lahi from the saddle and carrying her inside. Mara followed her eyes, taking in the Spartan interior, a narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and shelves lined with tins tools and a few worn books. A rifle hung on pegs over the mantel. It was the home of a man who expected nothing and needed no one. You'll take the bed, Rowan said, laying Lahi down gently and pulling a thick wool blanket over her. I'll sleep by the fire. Mara stood in the center of the room, Rowan's old cavalry coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She looked small and out of place, yet her presence filled the silence he had cultivated for so long. Thank you, she said, the words sounding inadequate. For all of it. Get some rest was all he said in reply. He spent the night on a bedroll by the hearth, his rifle within arm's reach. But he didn't sleep. He listened to the quiet breathing of Mara and Lahi, a sound that was both a comfort and a burden. He thought of the locket in his pocket, of the dead soldier's optimistic eyes, and of the cold, precise killer who had dropped it. He thought of the fraudulent debt ledger, the poisoned parents, and the web of corruption centered on widow Clark. This was bigger than a simple land dispute. It was a conspiracy rooted in something deep and rotten. And he was standing right in the middle of it. The next morning, he made a decision. He couldn't protect them by hiding. He had to fight back. He had to uncover the truth. I have to ride out, he told Mara over a breakfast of coffee and hard biscuits. There are things I need to check. Deeds records. I need to know exactly what we're up against. Fear flickered in her eyes. You're leaving us, only for a day or two. The men who followed us won't find this place, not easily. You'll be safer here than anywhere else. Keep the door barred and don't light a fire at night. My rifle is there, he said, nodding to the mantel. Do you know how to use one? Mara's chin lifted. My father taught me. I can shoot. Rowan nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Good. He left them with enough food and water and rode east toward the next county seat where the territorial land office was located. The ride gave him time to think, to piece together the fragments of information. A dishonored soldier turned bank robber, a greedy town matriarch, a suspicious debt, and 2 murdered parents. It felt connected, but the thread was still missing. At the county clerk's office, a dusty, book-filled room that smelled of aging paper and stale tobacco, he posed as a prospective land buyer. After an hour of poring over plat maps and transfer ledgers, he found it. The Dawson homestead registered to Thomas Dawson for 20 years had been transferred just 2 weeks ago. The new owner wasn't the widow Clark. It was a holding company, the Redemption Development Corporation. And the sole proprietor listed on the incorporation papers filed a month prior was Silas Croft. The widow wasn't just his partner. She was his front. This was Croft's play, and it was far more sophisticated than a simple land grab. But why this particular piece of land? Why go to the trouble of poisoning forgery and murder for one small farm? The clerk, a talkative old man with ink-stained fingers, provided another piece of the puzzle. Croft, you say, name sounds familiar. Ah, yes, ex-military man. Heard he was run out of the army after the war. Something about a court-martial. A real scandal. The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. He asked the clerk which campaign Croft had served in. The answer confirmed his deepest, most buried fear. Silas Croft had been a captain in the 3rd Division under General Wallace, the same disastrous campaign where Rowan had served as lead scout. The same campaign where he had made the choice that had haunted his every waking moment since. The memory he'd felt when he first saw the locket wasn't just a ghost. It was a warning. He rode back to the cabin with a cold dread settling in his stomach. The world had suddenly shrunk. This wasn't a random encounter. His past of the one he had ridden so hard and so far to escape was riding right back at him. When he arrived, the cabin was quiet and still. He found Mara at the small table, her face pale. In her hands, she held a tarnished, leather-bound album, her family's. It was open to a faded photograph. "I found this in my mother's sewing box," she said, her voice trembling. She pushed the album across the table. The photograph showed 2 men in Union uniforms, their arms slung around each other's shoulders in a gesture of easy camaraderie. One was her father, younger and smiling. The other was the boy from the locket. The same naive, optimistic eyes stared out from the faded image. "My father never spoke much about the war," Mara whispered. "But he kept this. He said this man, this boy, was the best friend he ever had." Rowan pulled the silver locket from his pocket and set it on the table beside the photograph. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty, cold and hard and undeniable. This wasn't just about land or money. This was about the war. It was about something that had happened a decade ago, something that had bound their families together in a tragedy whose final act was only now being played out. And Rowan Pike was no longer an outsider caught in the crossfire. He was standing at the heart of the storm. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken questions. Rowan stared at the photograph of Mara's father beside the young soldier, the 2 images, the album and the locket, forming a bridge across a decade of secrets. The young Deputy Miller was the key. He was the weak link in the chain of command that bound Widow Clark and Silas Croft to the town of Redemption. Rowan knew he had to break him. He rode back into town the next day, not as a drifter, but as a man with a purpose. He found Deputy Miller sweeping the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office, his movements listless, his eyes downcast. The town still treated him like a pariah. Rowan cornered him in the alley between the jailhouse and the smithy. "We need to talk." Rowan said, his voice low, but carrying an authority that made the young man flinch. Miller's face was a mask of terror. "I don't know anything." He stammered, his gaze darting around nervously. "You know about the widow Clark." Rowan pressed, stepping closer, cutting off any escape. "You know she's got something on you. I saw the way you looked when they were blaming you for the robbery. That wasn't guilt. It was fear." The deputy's facade crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and a wave of desperate relief seemed to wash over him. "My pa," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He took a loan from her to buy our farm. The note's come due and she's threatening to foreclose. She said if I..." If I looked the other way, if I made sure Sheriff Gable stayed out of her business, she'd forgive the debt. Looking the other way from what? Rowan demanded. The Dawsons? Miller nodded, shamefaced. She wanted their land. Said Mr. Dawson had a debt too. But I knew it wasn't right. Thomas Dawson was an honest man. And then, they died. So sudden. It wasn't natural, I swear it. The words tumbled out of him now, a torrent of confession. The widow told me to keep my mouth shut. Then Croft showed up. He's the real power here. The widow, she does whatever he says. He's the one who wanted the Dawsons gone. And why? Rowan's voice was like stone. Why did Croft want them dead? This was the question that mattered, the one that led back to the war, to the locket, to the photograph. Deputy Miller took a shaky breath, his eyes wide with the terror of the secret he was about to share. Because Thomas Dawson wasn't just a farmer. He said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. During the war, he was Silas Croft's sergeant, his second in command. And he was going to testify. There was a hearing scheduled with the Army Adjutant's office. Dawson was the key witness set to testify against Captain Croft for war crimes. Rowan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. What war crimes? Stealing Army payrolls, Miller said. Thousands of dollars in gold coin. Croft was skimming it during the chaos of General Wallace's campaign. Dawson knew everything. He had the proof, the ledgers, the documents. Croft was dishonorably discharged, but they couldn't make the theft charges stick without Dawson's testimony. The hearing was delayed, then Dawson mustered out and moved here to get away from it all. He must have thought Croft would never find him. It all made a sickening kind of sense. The fever that had killed Mara's parents was poison, a brutally efficient way to silence the main witness. The debt ledger was a fabrication, a legalistic cover for the theft of their land. And Croft wasn't just back for the land. He was back to sanitize his past, to eliminate anyone who knew the truth, most importantly, to find the evidence Thomas Dawson had hidden. The payroll ledgers. He thinks the evidence is still on their farm, Rowan realized aloud. That's why he needs the land. Yes, Miller confirmed. He's been having his men search the place top to bottom. But he's getting impatient. He knows the girls are the only ones left who might know where their father hid those papers. He wants them. The fight for a small piece of land had transformed into a race against time to protect the living legacy of a decade-old crime. Mara and Lahi were not just orphans. They were the last remaining link to Silas Croft's treason, the keepers of a secret they didn't even know they possessed. And Rowan, by a cruel twist of fate, was now their sole protector, his own dark past, with that army campaign looming over him like a storm cloud. He was no longer just helping strangers. He was tangled in the very history he had tried to bury. He rode back to the cabin with the urgency of a man pursued by demons. When he arrived, the sun was low, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The truth he carried felt like a physical weight, and he knew he had to share it with Mara. He found her by the creek washing clothes. He told her everything: the poison, the stolen payroll, her father's role as a witness, and Croft's true reason for hunting them. She listened in silence, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the wet fabric in her hands. The color drained from her face, but her eyes, when she finally looked up at him, were not filled with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. "My father was a good man," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He was an honorable man, and that monster murdered him. He murdered them both." Her grief hardened into resolve. "The ledgers, I don't know where they are. But if they exist, we have to find them. We have to finish what my father started." Rowan knew she was right. But he also knew that their decision had just turned his quiet cabin from a sanctuary into a target. Silas Croft was not a man who would be deterred by a closed door. He was a predator, and now that he knew Rowan was protecting his prey, he would bypass the town's flimsy authority and come for them himself. The attack came 2 nights later, under the cover of a moonless sky. Rowan had been expecting it. He'd spent the day fortifying the cabin, barring the windows, with thick planks reinforcing the door, and setting up positions where they could defend from 2 sides. The first sign of their approach was the snap of a twig in the woods beyond the clearing. Rowan, who had been sitting in the dark, was instantly alert. He moved to the window slit. He'd cut his rifle already in his hands. "Mara, get down," he whispered. "They're here." Mara, who had been sleeping fitfully, was instantly awake. She grabbed the spare rifle from the mantel, her movements sure and practiced, and took up a position at the other window. Lahi, awakened by the sudden tension, huddled behind a stack of firewood in the corner, her face pale but her eyes wide and watchful. The night erupted in a volley of gunfire. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying. It was a chaotic, undisciplined assault designed to terrify and overwhelm. But Rowan was calm. He waited, letting them waste their ammunition, counting the muzzle flashes. 4 of them spread out in an arc. "They're trying to draw our fire," he murmured to Mara. "Don't shoot until you have a clear target." The firing stopped. The silence that followed was even more tense. Then a figure darted from behind a tree, making a run for the porch. Rowan's rifle barked once. The man crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain. Another attacker opened fire from the right, providing cover. Mara tracked the muzzle flash, took a steadying breath, and fired. A scream echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of a body falling. She had not been lying about her father's lessons. She was a capable shot, her fear channeled into deadly focus. They were now in a tense siege, exchanging sporadic fire for the better part of an hour. Rowan and Mara worked together with an unspoken understanding, a rhythm born of shared desperation. Lahi, overcoming her fear, crawled between them, helping to reload the rifles, her small hands surprisingly steady as she pressed fresh cartridges into the loading gates. They were no longer victims. They were a unit, a family fighting for its life. They managed to wound 1 more of Croft's men, and the attack faltered. The remaining gunman lost his nerve and fled into the darkness. But the victory was short-lived. A voice cold and familiar cut through the night from the edge of the clearing. It was Silas Croft. "Pike, I know you're in there, Pike," he called out, his voice amplified by the stillness. Rowan froze. Pike. He hadn't called him Drifter. He'd used his name. "I have a guest with me," Croft continued. "A young man who seems to have misplaced his loyalties. I believe you know him." 2 of his men dragged a bound and gagged figure into the faint starlight. It was Deputy Miller. He was bleeding from a cut on his head, his eyes wild with terror. "This is my offer." Pike Croft's voice rang out, devoid of all emotion. "Send out the girl, Mara. Send her out, and the deputy lives. You have 5 minutes to decide. After that, I will execute him and burn your cabin to the ground, with all of you inside." A gut-wrenching moral dilemma slammed into Rowan. He had set out to save an innocent man, and in doing so, he had led Croft right to him. Now, to save that man, he had to sacrifice Mara. It was an impossible choice. He looked at Mara. Her face was grim in the dim light, her rifle held tight against her shoulder. She knew what was at stake. The siege wasn't over. It had just become personal. The wind began to pick up, howling through the pines, carrying the scent of rain and dust. A storm was coming. The final confrontation was at hand, and Silas Croft had just ensured that no matter the outcome, there would be blood on Rowan Pike's hands. The ultimatum hung in the air, as heavy and oppressive as the storm clouds gathering overhead. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. 4 minutes. "Don't do it," Rowan Mara said, her voice a fierce whisper. "You can't. It's what he wants. He'll kill him." Mara Rowan replied, his mind racing, cycling through tactics and possibilities, finding none that didn't end in death. And then, he'll burn us out anyway. Then we fight, she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. But Rowan knew a direct fight was suicide. Croft held all the cards. He had the high ground, a hostage, and more men. Rowan's only advantage was his knowledge of the terrain and Croft's own arrogance. He needed a different battlefield. The old church, Rowan said, a plan forming out of the desperate chaos in his mind. At the edge of town, it's abandoned. Walls are stone, but the roof is half collapsed. It offers cover, but it's unstable. He looked at Mara. I'm going to parley. I'll tell him to meet me there. Just him and me. We settle this once and for all. He'll never agree to that, Mara argued. He will, Rowan countered. This isn't just about you anymore. He knows who I am. This is personal for him too. I can feel it. He turned to her, his gaze intense. While I'm gone, you and Lahi need to slip out the back through the creek bed. Follow it downstream for a mile. There's an old trapper's line shack hidden in the rocks. Wait for me there. If I'm not back by sunrise, you keep going. Head east. Don't stop. He was giving her an escape, a chance he knew he might not have himself. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, her expression hardening. She nodded once. Rowan stepped onto the porch unarmed, his hands raised. Croft, he yelled into the wind, which was now whipping dust and leaves into the air. Your fight is with me. Let the deputy go. We meet at the old mission church. Dawn. Just you and me. There was a long silence. And then Croft's cold laughter drifted back. You think you're in a position to bargain, Pike. But you're right about one thing. My fight is with you. Dawn it is. But the deputy stays with me. An insurance policy. It was the best deal he was going to get. Rowan watched as Croft and his men melted back into the woods, dragging the deputy with them. He turned back to Mara. Go. Now? She hesitated, then threw her arms around him, a desperate clinging embrace. Come back, she whispered into his coat. I will, he promised, a vow he wasn't sure he could keep. He watched them disappear into the darkness of the creek bed, Lahi's small hand clutching her sister's, before turning his own attention to the coming storm, both in the sky and in his soul. The abandoned church stood on a low bluff overlooking Redemption, a skeletal ruin against the bruised, churning sky. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at the loose shingles and sent sheets of dust swirling through the gaping holes in the roof. Visibility was less than 20 feet. It was the perfect arena for a ghost to confront his past. Rowan entered through a collapsed section of the wall, his boots crunching on fallen plaster and broken glass. Inside the storm was a living presence. Dust devils danced down the nave, and the wind shrieked through the empty bell tower like a chorus of the damned. Silas Croft was waiting by the ruined altar. Deputy Miller was tied to a support beam, his face ashen with terror. Croft held his silver-plated Colt loosely at his side, his black duster billowing around him. He looked like a preacher of some dark, forgotten faith. I knew you'd come. Pike, Croft said, his voice cutting through the gale. You always did have a misplaced sense of duty. Let him go, Croft. Rowan said, his own voice steady, calm. This is between us. Everything in due time. Croft replied, a chilling smile playing on his lips. He took a step forward, the dim, dust-filtered light glinting off the silver locket he now held in his other hand. It was the one he had dropped. You picked this up, didn't you? I wondered where it had gone. It belonged to my brother, my younger brother Thomas. He tossed the locket. It spun through the air, and Rowan caught it instinctively. You remember him, don't you? Sergeant Pike Croft's voice turned venomous. Private Thomas Croft, 18 years old, fresh from Ohio. Believed in God and the Union and the orders of his commanding scout. The fragmented memories that had haunted Rowan for a decade slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The pine forest, the dawn raid, the impossible choice. We were pinned down. Rowan said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. A Confederate ambush. We were outnumbered 3-1. The only way out was through a narrow pass, but it was a bottleneck, a suicide run. So you sent a diversion, Croft hissed, his composure cracking, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. A small squad to draw their fire to make them think the main force was attacking from the flank. You needed a volunteer to lead them. Rowan could see it as if it were yesterday. Young Thomas Croft, his face alight with naive bravery, stepping forward. "I'll do it, Sergeant. For the Union." He was just a boy, Rowan whispered, the weight of his guilt crushing him. "He was my brother Croft." Roared the sound, swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. "And you sent him to his death to save your own skin," I read the commendation. Sergeant Pike made a difficult but necessary tactical decision, saving the lives of 30 men at the cost of 5. "You got a medal for murdering my brother." The vendetta was suddenly horrifyingly clear. It was never about the money. The stolen payrolls were an act of rebellion, a way to spit on the army that had celebrated his brother's sacrifice. Killing the Dawsons wasn't just about silencing a witness. It was about destroying a part of his past, a man who had served alongside him in that corrupt system. And now Rowan, the man he held responsible for it all. "Your friend Dawson knew the truth," Croft sneered. "He was going to testify against me, to put me away for stealing from the same army that gave you a medal for killing my blood. I couldn't let that happen. And I won't let you walk away." He raised his pistol. "You took my family, Pike. Now I'll take everyone you dare to care about. I'll kill you then. I'll hunt down that woman and her sister and erase them from the earth." In that moment, the fight became more than a struggle for survival. It was a battle for redemption. Rowan had to face the ghost of his most profound failure. He looked at the deputy, at the storm raging around them, and at the hate-filled eyes of the man before him. He dropped the locket. As it hit the floor, he lunged to the side, kicking over a pile of rotting timbers. The crash startled Croft, who fired wildly, the shot going wide and striking the bell tower support beam. A deep, groaning sound echoed from above. The entire structure was unstable. Rowan used the storm to his advantage. He kicked up clouds of dust, disappearing and reappearing in the swirling chaos like a phantom. He was no longer a soldier fighting an enemy. He was a scout using the environment as his weapon. Croft fired again and again, his precision lost to his rage and the blinding dust. Rowan circled behind him, using the crumbling pews for cover. He saw a length of thick rope from the old church bell dangling from the damaged tower. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took hold. "You blame me for his death, Croft." Rowan yelled, his voice seeming to come from all directions at once. But he volunteered. He died a soldier believing in something. You've twisted his memory into an excuse for murder and greed. "Silence!" Croft shrieked, spinning and firing into the dust. That was the opening Rowan needed. He vaulted over a pew, grabbed the swinging rope, and kicked off the wall. He swung through the heart of the church, a dark pendulum in the storm. He crashed into Croft, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The pistol skittered away into the darkness. The fight became a brutal, close-quarter struggle. They were two sides of the same coin, men forged and broken by the same war. But Rowan was fighting for a future for Mara and Lahi, while Croft was fighting for a dead past. As they wrestled on the dusty floor, another tremor shook the building. The bell tower groaned again, louder this time. Rowan managed to land a solid punch to Croft's jaw, dazing him for a second. It was just enough time. Rowan scrambled away, grabbed the discarded pistol, and got to his feet. He aimed it not at Croft, but at the already splintered support beam holding up the bell tower. He fired once. The beam cracked. With a sound like the world tearing apart, the entire bell tower collapsed inward, sending the massive iron bell timbers and a century of dust crashing down onto the spot where they had been fighting. Rowan had thrown himself clear, but Silas Croft was caught at the edge of the collapse. A heavy beam pinned his legs, trapping him beneath a mountain of debris. He was alive, but broken and defeated. Rowan stood over him, the gun steady in his hand. Croft glared up at him, his face a mask of pain and impotent fury. Killing him would be easy. It would be justice of a kind. But Rowan looked at the man trapped in the wreckage of his own hatred and saw only the tragic end of a path he himself had almost walked. He didn't pull the trigger. He walked over to Deputy Miller and cut him free. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. The dust inside the church began to settle, revealing the devastation. The climax was over. Rowan had survived not by being the better killer, but by choosing finally to build something instead of just destroying. As the first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting a weak gray light into the ruined church, the sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels approached. In the calm after the storm, a posse of federal marshals, alerted by a message Rowan had sent with a passing circuit rider days earlier, rode into Redemption. They found Rowan Pike standing guard over a captured Silas Croft, the young deputy beside him, battered but alive. The marshals took Croft into custody, his curses lost in the quiet morning air. Armed with Deputy Miller's testimony, they moved swiftly. A search of the old Dawson homestead, guided by a hunch from Mara, who remembered her father fixing a loose stone in the fireplace, uncovered a small oilskin-wrapped package. Inside were the payroll ledgers, the irrefutable proof of Croft's crimes. The web of corruption unraveled quickly. Widow Clark, stripped of Croft's protection and faced with the ledgers, was arrested for her role in the conspiracy. Her reign of fear over Redemption, ending not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Deputy Miller, cleared of all wrongdoing and hailed as a key witness, was offered the position of town sheriff, a role he accepted with a newfound, hard-won confidence. The town itself began to breathe again, the shadow of fear lifting. People looked at Rowan not as a drifter, but as the man who had faced the storm and brought the dawn. But he wanted no part of their gratitude. His work there was done. He, Mara, and Lahi did not return to his isolated cabin in the woods. Instead, they went to the Dawson homestead. It was neglected and overgrown, haunted by the tragedy that had occurred there. But it was their home. Together, they began the slow, arduous work of rebuilding. They mended the fences, cleared the fields, and scrubbed the floors, washing away the stains of the past with hard work and shared hope. The small, lonely cabin that had once been Rowan's sanctuary was left behind, a relic of a life he no longer wanted. Weeks turned into a season. The first green shoots of corn pushed through the dark, freshly tilled earth. The farm, like the three souls who tended it, was coming back to life. Rowan Pike, the man who had sworn off all attachments, found himself inexplicably rooted. He was no longer a ghost drifting through the world. He was a husband, a father, a part of a family. One cool evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden glow over their land, Rowan took the silver locket from his pocket. He had carried it with him all this time, a final, heavy piece of his past. He didn't throw it away. He didn't bury it. He walked with Mara and Lahi to the small family plot at the edge of the property where her parents were buried. Next to their graves stood a simple, newly carved wooden marker. It didn't bear a name, only the words, "A Union soldier at rest." It was the gravestone Rowan had made for Silas Croft's lost brother. He knelt and gently set the locket down on the earth at the base of the marker. It was a quiet act of forgiveness for the boy, for Silas, and most of all, for himself. He was no longer haunted. The war was finally over. As they walked back toward the warm light of the farmhouse, Lahi, who had been holding both their hands, looked up at them, Her voice, once a desperate plea in a dusty street, was now filled with a calm, happy certainty. My big sister found the perfect husband for her, and he takes care of us both. Rowan looked at Mara. She smiled back her eyes, full of a love and promise that was stronger than any hardship they had endured. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. The three of them stood for a moment, a true family, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, silhouetted against the endless, hopeful expanse of their future.